Bitcoin. It's a big deal in China. It can be used to subvert government controls, and the government can't shut it down. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. For many Americans, Bitcoin is a niche thing. It's hard to use as an investment because the value goes up and down like crazy, and you can't even buy much with it. Well, you can, I guess. There's a lot of places on the dark web. But anyway, for a lot of Chinese people, Bitcoin is something more. See, the Chinese Communist Party has put a lot of controls on people's money and monitors every transaction they make. But Bitcoin is a way to go around that system. It can be used by Chinese dissidents and corrupt officials alike. At the Oslo Freedom Forum, China Uncensored producer Matt Gnaizda sat down with Bitcoin expert Leo Wheese. He's the president of the Bitcoin Association of Hong Kong.
Leo, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin is one of many cryptocurrencies, but it's by far the most popular and the biggest. So let's focus mainly on that.
I believe it's the most liquid by far, which is the most important property of Bitcoin, especially in the context of China.
So, speaking of China, obviously, is Bitcoin legal in China?
I would argue that yes, Bitcoin is legal in China, but we don't know exactly what that legal means. We don't know exactly what the...
that's what I love about China, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's legal, but...
And if something changes, it will first change on the ground before the law changes. So we will first be able to observe how police, how Ministry of Security, how the Public Security Bureau, how they interact with Bitcoin traders, with cryptocurrency exchanges, before we see the law changing.
So what is the situation on the ground with Bitcoin?
Bitcoin exchanges have been heavily restricted to the point that centralized exchanges as we know them from the US to Europe no longer exist. Cryptocurrency mining operations have been significantly sized down, partly because the operators are afraid that they will have their equipment seized, partly because they found other opportunities overseas, but also because they're very much afraid that this might at any point, the legal situation might at any point change.
Yeah, well, so there's really kind of two things going on. There's the actual trading of Bitcoin, and then there's the mining. So I assume Bitcoin mines are a little bit like Chinese coal mines, dangerous, dirty conditions, a lot of hard labor with migrant workers.
So we have an entire supply chain. The actual chips are very rarely made in China. China still doesn't have the technological know-how to produce these incredibly accelerated 60 nanometer small transistors.
So, what do the actual Bitcoin mines look like?
The Bitcoin miner is a machine roughly the size of a shoebox with two fans that makes a lot of noise and consumes a lot of electricity. And a Bitcoin mine would be 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 of those shoebox-sized machines stacked in a warehouse, making a lot of noise and emitting a lot of heat. The electricity has to come from somewhere preferably cheap, which is most of the time hydroelectric power, meaning those are dams. They've been built by the central government to incentivize industry in especially places like Tibet, in Xinjiang, in Yunnan, in Sichuan, but these places haven't been, the cheap electricity hasn't been enough in attracting businesses to those places.
But it is enough to get Bitcoin miners to actually want to utilize that electricity.
A factory very much needs a large and a big road leading to the hydrogen dam. The Bitcoin miner doesn't necessarily need that. They can haul the machinery with small pickup trucks. They can put that machinery on the spot, and all they need is a relatively low latency a data uplink to their server, which can sit anywhere.
Okay, so where are these Bitcoin mines being set up? Are they in Beijing? Or are they out in the countryside?
They would be out in the mountains where there's cheap hydroelectric power, meaning dams that, especially right now in the rainy season, fill up with water, and that water and energy can be turned into electricity very cheaply. And there is no demand for this electricity, meaning the Bitcoin miners can get this electricity for almost free or free.
So basically, the Chinese Bitcoin miners are undercutting the American workers.
They are undercutting the US electricity prices, which are far higher, but in places like Upper New York State or Washington State can also be low enough to be attractive to Bitcoin miners.
Or like Iceland, I guess, right? They have a lot of geothermal.
Iceland has a lot of interesting electricity too.
Okay.
They have. So what makes Iceland a little bit different is that Bitcoin miners there compete with aluminum smelts, for example. Iceland is easily accessible by ship, and you can haul in aluminum, smelt it down, which mainly consumes electricity, and haul the aluminum bricks back out. You cannot do that in Yunnan or Sichuan because the roads up to those mountains don't exist.
Right, but you also don't need to haul Bitcoins anywhere.
Exactly, and Bitcoin can then consume that electricity wherever the electricity is. In most cases, we have to bring the electricity to wherever the humans are.
So what's the scale of Bitcoin mining in China?
It's probably 0.5% of the total electricity consumption. So it would already show up in statistics, but it's not yet at the point where the government deeply worries about the, energy is highly political too, but they're not yet at the point where they really worry about this. They worry more about keeping their local governments happy, and for these local governments, it might be a very lucrative side business, given that the central government failed to attract businesses to these areas, which was implicitly promised by building these mines. And taking away that income stream now is also a bit difficult.
Well, I mean, local governments in China love these lucrative side businesses. So,
yeah.
When it comes to actually trading in Bitcoin in China, now you said it's legal, but like kind of legal.
Yeah.
So let's get into that a little bit. What does the central government think about Bitcoin?
They don't like it. They don't like the idea. They are probably only on a hypothetical level afraid of this severely undermining them. I believe Bitcoin is still small enough that it does not yet pose a threat, but the hypothetical threat is there.
And what is the hypothetical threat?
The hypothetical threat is that people are able to completely circumvent capital controls, able to transact truly between each other without a central party being able to intervene, the literal central party being able to intervene, and the renminbi simply losing its significance as money because people prefer something else.
Because right now the great majority of financial transactions between businesses and consumers are made through WeChat Pay and Alipay.
Yeah.
And so now you have this third option, which is Bitcoin, but they're not being tracked with the same, the government may not have access to that data, for example.
The government does not have access to this data, but more importantly, the government isn't able to shut down your Bitcoin account. The government isn't able to monitor your Bitcoin transactions. When it comes to national transactions, I would argue Bitcoin is almost not used at all. WeChat and Alipay or even bank wires are still relatively reliable. It's not that common to have these accounts shut down. They are accessible to a large portion of the population. What is more difficult is interacting for especially small businesses with companies overseas, where they might have difficulties making those payments because of capital controls, for example, or simply because of the country that they do business with not having a well-established financial system.
Right, or on the other hand, if you're, say, a Chinese dissident or maybe a corrupt official, then the central authorities would have the ability technically to shut down your ability to access your money.
Yeah.
But if you have money stored in Bitcoin, then you could be using that.
Foreign charities, NGOs, have been completely cut off from funding any type of social activism, any type of change in China, even very innocent organizations that we wouldn't think are on the hit list of the Communist Party are being shut down. For example, making cities greener, initiatives to cut down on road traffic, initiatives to educate children.
How dare they undermine the Communist Party by making the environment better?
Yeah,
I mean that's really tragic.
Yeah, the Communist Party definitely has a monopoly on keeping cities crappy.
So there are other cryptocurrencies. There's Ethereum. There's my favorite, of course, is Dogecoin.
Yeah, wonderful.
So
wow, much money.
Yes. So what's the situation with those other cryptocurrencies?
There's one aspect of Bitcoin that Bitcoin itself is only good as a tool for. people in China have been deprived of opportunities to invest their savings, to invest their income. The property market is largely seen as inflated. The stock market has been, turned into more of a scam, and banks are not really offering any attractive investment tools. So there is a lot of pressure for people to seek other investment opportunities. And Bitcoin itself does not look like an attractive investment opportunity. To a classical investor, it's like gold. It's not interesting. It doesn't pay interest. It doesn't run a profit. It doesn't give you kickbacks. And a lot of the other cryptocurrencies are designed to be more investment vehicles. And I believe the ICO bubble, the initial coin offering trend, was largely driven by China as a mean for people to invest in startups, as a way for people to invest in all sorts of crazy ideas and projects. And Bitcoin is very much a mean to be able to move that money into those projects. Bitcoin, buying Bitcoin with renminbi, exchanging those Bitcoin for Ethereum, and then using those Ethereum inside of the Ethereum platform to fund projects. ICOs are completely banned. This is probably also part of a larger trend of investment scams. China has been riddled with multi-level marketing schemes like open Ponzi's, investment opportunities that the bike sharing craze is probably also a good example. That was magnitudes bigger than the ICO craze. And the Chinese government is very much afraid of a large percentage of the population losing their money in such schemes because people expect the government to bail them out in a way. And these grievances with startups failing can easily turn into unrest, can turn into protests, and they'd rather shut down that entire investment ecosystem before they have any large group of cryptocurrency investors protesting on the streets.
So they're not so much concerned about people losing their money as they are the unrest that could potentially follow from that. So are the average Chinese citizen, are they using Bitcoin to make transactions, or is this only like a pretty small group?
My impression is that the number of people who are trading cryptocurrencies is relatively high. This is probably similar to how people are playing video games on their phone. It can be quite addictive to trade with leverage. It has a bit of a casino feel. China also is not very welcoming of casinos, of gambling, but people demand these kind of products. And cryptocurrency exchanges is certainly one convenient way to gamble. And a lot of this activity then happens on cryptocurrency exchanges that are based overseas, which target Chinese traders and investors mainly through apps like WeChat or ads on the internet. And people would then go to some of these local exchange platforms where they find, in a peer-to-peer market, find somebody else who is willing to sell them Bitcoin. And they would then make most of the time it's Alipay, but bank wires and WeChat also exist, a transaction directly to the other person rather than to a central exchange.
And that way it's not being tracked.
Bitcoin. That way it's much harder to track and much harder to shut down.
Right. I mean, I guess if you're using Alipay to make the payment, then it can be tracked.
It can be tracked, yeah, but Alipay doesn't necessarily know what this payment was for. And unless you make a lot of these transactions, it might not show up it might not cause any red flags.
Right. Now, the capital controls in place now to keep money from leaving the country are something like $50,000 a year is the maximum that you can transfer out of China.
Yeah.
So how does Bitcoin affect that?
In summary, Bitcoin allows individuals who do not want to move millions, but rather want to move tens of thousands, a convenient way to have access to the same money channels as people who move millions. So it's still possible to move millions and millions of US dollars out of the country. Some of this is fake invoicing, some of this is tricking the bank into somehow approving this transaction. Some people who have a lot of money still have access to these channels. People who don't have a lot of money do not. They will have definitely trouble in a meaningful way with meaningful cost move $100,000, let's say, to the US to finance their kids' education. Now, because of Bitcoin, they can go to these peer-to-peer markets, buy $100,000 worth of Bitcoin, and then directly in the US, it's very easy to sell those Bitcoin. You can pretty much be put directly into the bank account of the son or daughter in the US, who can then use that to pay for their school tuition, for example. It's also popular to have debit cards that can be loaded with Bitcoin, and then in the US, you can just go to any place that accepts Visa or MasterCard and spend those US dollars.
Oh, good. So now the middle class in China have, equal opportunity to, take their money illegally out of China.
Yeah,
it's really
and
important.
not only are they now able to move money out of China, but this happens without a lot of coordination, and that makes it relatively hard to shut down. If there was a single organization that would coordinate in moving large chunks of money out of the country by pooling funds from, let's say, you find 100 people who want to move out $50,000, and then you move out 5 million in a single tranche, which you could do. But that requires a lot of coordination and a lot of trust. And with Bitcoin, there isn't really anybody in charge of this. You cannot find the kingpin. You cannot easily find that one organization that leads to these 1,000, 10,000 people to then lose access to their money channels, but rather you have to go after these 10,000 people individually.
So there's not, one Mr. Bit sitting in a chair and he's got a claw and a little cat there.
Which is how it's in the traditional world. In the traditional world, you have the junkets, you have the insurance companies, you have the banks, and you can go to them and tell them what's acceptable and what not. And if they believe they're overstepping their lines, then you can make them disappear. But in Bitcoin, you have to go after every single offender individually, and that's quite difficult, that's quite expensive, and so far we simply haven't seen that happening. But in China, it's entirely possible that the government might go through these efforts.
Right, but despite all these issues, you're saying Bitcoin is still legal in China, technically.
Yeah, they have not directly come out and said, we do not want anybody to use this ever for anything. We do not want anybody to own this. We don't know exactly why that is. I believe a big portion of this is that it's still small enough, it flies under the radar. They do not want to give attention to something that they believe doesn't deserve that attention. Why prop something up in the international media and the local chatter? There's this popular saying in Silicon Valley: invest in everything that China bans. And for China to ban Bitcoin would certainly give it a lot of legitimacy in that this might actually be useful. It, in the current situation, does not, unfortunately, matter enough that they feel a need to ban it. They might also not want to embarrass themselves by banning something that then will continue to exist in China. And
I'm just thinking about their Silicon Valley saying, because it's invest in everything that China bans, but also invest in China regardless of whether the return's good, whether they make you self-censor.
yeah, there's a big fear of missing out from tech companies when it comes to China.
That certainly seems to be the case.
Yeah. There's also a big fear of missing out for Chinese investors when it comes to overseas tech.
But what I like about Bitcoin is that it can be used by corrupt officials and political dissidents. Really, it can bring people together.
It's entirely neutral. It doesn't care who you are or where you're from. And I believe that's its biggest strength. It allows people to have access to a global financial system without having to show their ID and without having to reveal their real name or their gender identity or their passport.
All right, final question. So everyone wants to know, should I invest in Bitcoin? So what do you think the future of Bitcoin is, in the sense of how do you think the way China treats Bitcoin is going to affect the future value of Bitcoin?
I wouldn't think of putting money into Bitcoin or buying Bitcoin as investing. I believe it's pure speculation, and what you are speculating on is very important. You're speculating on whether this can become money. You're not necessarily speculating on whether this can become global money that replaces the US dollar, but whether this can be used as money by people on the internet all around the world. And in the context of China, we do have a very reasonable fear that China will be increasingly cut off from the international financial financial system in the same way that Ukraine or Russia have been cut off, in the same way that Pakistan, Afghanistan or Syria have been entirely cut off. And China will continue to want to be connected to the rest of the world. They want to trade. In a way, their survival depends on their ability to trade. And if they cannot use the US dollar because they're being cut off from it, and if the renminbi is not accepted around the world, then they will have to use whatever is liquid and whatever is useful. So if Chinese individual businesses or even the state want to continue to transact in a world where they're increasingly cut off, it's quite likely that Bitcoin will be their money, and it's quite likely that Bitcoin then becomes money, and our speculation turns out to be right.
So essentially, the worse things get in China and the more inflation their currency sees, the more demand there's going to be for Bitcoin in China.
Yes, and by its trading partners. I believe eventually this will ultimately benefit the individual in China. This will benefit the small businesses much more than the large ones. The state will still try to intervene. It will still try to control. It raises the very interesting questions of whether sanctions are just, of whether sanctions against a totalitarian regime like China should be in place. And if they should be in place, then Bitcoin is probably not a tool for good, because it allows these individuals and allows these entities to circumvent these sanctions.
But it can still be a tool for the little guy.
Exactly. And that's what I believe in, and I believe these individuals have the right to transact, and I believe the world and China is better off if these people are able to engage in global trade, because ultimately this interconnectivity makes them far less likely to be an aggressor, and it makes it far more likely that the power inside of the country lies with these individuals and lies with these organizations.
All right, great. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.